All right, welcome to lecture ES-1, the first of the endocrine lectures. In this, we're going to start by going over sort of a general model of the endocrine system. We'll be talking about endocrine versus exocrine glands and some of the major components of the endocrine system. That should be endocrine, not endocrine. We'll then talk about hormones, what hormones are, types of hormones, how they're synthesized, how they're stored and released. We'll talk some about hormone receptors, intracellular versus extracellular receptors, and some examples. And then we'll just talk a little bit about how hormones are controlled, and that will lead us into the second lecture, which will focus mostly on some examples of how how hormones are used. Hi, okay, let's talk about the endocrine system. So when we talked about ways in which the body coordinates its actions, we talked about two kinds of long-range cell signaling. Neurocrine, which is what the nervous system uses, where you have that very targeted response of an electrical signal that causes a release of a chemical messenger. And then we talked about endocrine transmission, where you have one cell which releases a chemical into the blood that then circulates through the whole body, and anything that has a receptor responds to it. That's the model that the endocrine system uses. It's a way of coordinating functions throughout the body, but rather than using the targeted rapid communication, it uses broader, slower communication. So the general model for endocrine system signaling is that a cell releases a chemical messenger into the blood. We call that messenger a hormone. We'll talk in a little bit about what has to be true for us to consider something a hormone. So then, our chemical messenger can interact with any cell that has a receptor for it. So since it's in the blood, pretty much all cells in the body are exposed to the message. So any cell with a receptor can respond to that message. And it's worth noting that the cell releasing the messenger doesn't have to know, or in fact can't know, who's going to respond to it. That's not under that cell's control, whereas with the neurocrine system it is. The cell sending the message targets specific other cells. Here the cell sending the message just broadcasts it, and it has no way of knowing who's going to get that message. So in a way, this is more like, this is almost like Twitter if you didn't know who's following you. You've just decided, there's a message I want to give out to the world, and I'll let everything else in the world decide what to do about it. Whereas with neurocrine, you'd be specifically saying, hey you, here's the message, here's the message you need to get. So any cell with the receptor can respond, and then that signal has to be terminated. Kind of like when we talked about at a synapse in the nervous system, we release a neurotransmitter into the synapse, and then that neurotransmitter has to be removed or deactivated in some way so the message can end, so we can then send another message. In the endocrine system, there is going to have to be some way of terminating an endocrine signal, of removing it from the blood, because we don't usually want that to be circulating forever. That's not really the point of the message. So there's going to be some way of getting rid of it. We'll talk about them. Usually these messages leave the body in the kidneys or are broken down in the liver, but there's a few other possibilities, which we'll get to. Now, it's worth taking a moment to talk about how, I've said here, cells releasing chemical messengers. Usually when we think of the endocrine system, we think of glands. We think about specific organs called glands, and the job of a gland is to secrete some sort of chemical messenger. But that's not always the case for endocrine transmission. It kind of usually is. So let's take a moment to talk about the idea of glands and other things that can secrete chemical messages. So okay. So a gland is an organ which secretes a chemical. But not all glands are endocrine glands. So we can take a moment here to distinguish between the idea of exocrine versus endocrine. two different kinds of glands. And look at the words. Exo, outward, endo, within. So an exocrine gland secretes materials down a duct. Some kind of tube, some sort of channel into a space. Now that could be onto the skin, so the space is outside, so something like a sweat gland or a sebaceous gland secretes materials down a tube into the outside of the body space, in those cases. Or it could be inside. So, for example, some digestive glands secrete materials down a tube into the digestive tract, another space inside the body. But exocrine glands always have tubes, and they secrete into an area, some sort of open area. Endocrine glands secrete materials into the blood. They don't have a duct. In the case of endocrine glands, the cells release their chemical and it goes directly into the blood. No duct. So, things like, say, the adrenal cortex secretes its chemicals, its hormones, directly into the blood, or the pituitary gland is an endocrine gland. Now, one useful one to think about this, there's one gland that's actually both. The pancreas has both functions. It works as an exocrine and an endocrine gland. So in the pancreas, we have some cells. Let's just kind of sketch a pancreas here. So the pancreas has this duct. And around that duct, we will have clusters of cells Those clusters secrete their materials into that duct, so that then travels down the pancreatic duct and enters the duodenum, which is part of the digestive tract. So some cells in the pancreas are working as exocrine glands. They secrete digestive enzymes, in this case, which travel down the pancreatic duct and into the digestive tract. So down a duct into a space. But other cells in the pancreas, here's some blood vessels going through the pancreas. Other cells in the pancreas are oriented, that's out of ink, are oriented around these blood vessels. Those cells in the pancreas are secreting their materials directly into the blood rather than down the duct. So those are the part of the pancreas that acts as an endocrine gland. Those are where we get things like insulin and glucagon, which are hormones from the pancreas. Same organ, but different parts of it are working as either exocrine or endocrine glands. Alrighty. Now, one more thing on this is that some things which participate in endocrine signaling are not glands at all. They are individual cells or sort of diffuse groups of cells. One good example of that is the immune system. In the immune system, there are cells in the immune system that secrete important messenger chemicals into the blood that act on receptors in the body. They are definitely hormones, except they're not coming from any sort of gland. They're coming from kind of scattered cells in the body. So for a while, people have been reluctant to call those hormones. Instead, they call them cytokines. But they're not really fundamentally different from hormones. They're another kind of blood-borne messenger chemical. So whether the immune system is an endocrine organ, that depends on who you ask and what definitions they're using. But you should know that the immune system definitely participates in endocrine signaling, whether or not it is technically an endocrine thing, in any case. So, what I wanted to do next was just give you a quick list of some important glands and other things that participate in the endocrine system. And then that'll be the end of this first part, and then we'll get on to talking about exactly what a hormone is and how they work. So, Let's take a second here to erase. And let's talk about endocrine organs. So if we were going to make a list of major endocrine organs, glands that everyone agrees are definitely part of the endocrine system, we would include things like the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the adrenal cortex. These are really things that don't have a lot of function outside of the endocrine system. The pineal gland, the hypothalamus, although that certainly has roles outside of the endocrine system. The parathyroid glands, yeah, that's a pretty good list. So let's very quickly talk about what some of these do, just to give you some stuff to hang new knowledge on. So the pituitary gland secretes quite a variety of hormones, most of which actually control other endocrine glands. Sometimes people have referred to the pituitary as the master gland because it in turn controls other glands largely. There's some issues with that, but we'll get to that. So I'm not going to list those now. We're actually going to spend some time in the next lecture specifically on the pituitary. The thyroid gland mostly secretes thyroid hormones, which are involved in a lot of things. Also, calcitonin, which is involved in regulating calcium balance in the body. The adrenal cortex secretes mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Things like cortisol for that and aldosterone. Those are just two examples. They aren't the only ones. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which has a role in regulating circadian rhythm and some other stuff. The hypothalamus secretes some important things that gets kind of subtle. The hypothalamus actually plays a major role in controlling the pituitary. So when we talk about the pituitary being the master gland, really the hypothalamus is a master gland in that it controls the pituitary largely. So it secretes hormones that influence the pituitary as well as other hormones in the body. But really this isn't a gland exactly, it's nerve tissue. So how exactly you count that is difficult, but it is unquestionably a major endocrine organ, even though it's also part of the brain. And the parathyroid mostly secretes parathyroid hormone, which is involved in calcium regulation. So this would be a short list of some of the major endocrine organs. These are, other than the hypothalamus, these pretty much have no role outside of endocrine signaling. So now we can look at a list of other important endocrine organs that also play an important role outside of the endocrine system. All right, now let's look at things that are glands but that also have important non-endocrine functions. So here we're looking at things like the thymus, which plays an important role in the immune system. There are some immune cells that come from here, but it also secretes some important hormones that are involved in influencing the immune system. The pancreas, which we mentioned, it's a major digestive organ, but it also secretes insulin and glucagon, which are involved in regulating blood sugar. And the gonads. So that would be the testes or the ovaries. These gonads, they produce gametes, sperm or eggs, important reproductive cells, but they also secrete important hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and such that are involved in regulating a number of things in addition to reproductive cycles. So those are some glands that also play major non-endocrine roles. Now, for a third category, there's a number of things which aren't primarily glands. Their main function is not as glands, but they still secrete some important endocrine materials. So, if we were to have non-glands with important endocrine roles, we would have things like skin. Skin secretes something which ends up being effectively becoming vitamin D, but it acts as a hormone for a while. Adipose tissue. That's fat tissue. That secretes an important hormone called leptin, which is involved in regulating appetite and the feeling of enoughness. Adipose tissue can also secrete some estrogens. Some other ones in here, the heart, which secretes something called atrial natriuretic peptide, also known as ANP. Atrial natriuretic peptide is involved. It plays a role in regulating kidney function and involved in blood pressure regulation through that. The kidneys, which make erythropoietin, which is involved in regulating red blood cell production. They are also involved in that whole vitamin D system through something called calcitriol, but I'm not going to get into that right now. The gastrointestinal tract, which secretes a number of important hormones. Secretin, cholecystokinin, a couple called GIP and GLP. There's actually also gastrin and ghrelin. All of those play roles in regulating digestive function, appetite, and blood sugar, among other things. The liver puts out a number of what we call prohormones, things which are inactive versions of hormones. So we talked about one already, angiotensinogen comes from the liver. That's not a hormone when it's made, but it gets turned into a hormone by renin. So a lot of things in the body participate in important endocrine signaling, even if they themselves are not glands. So just have a sense of where all those things are. It would be good to be able to describe some important hormones released by at least many of these, in case you were asked. That should about do it for this first section. For section 2, we're going to talk about what a hormone is and how some of them are made.